Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode Around the Fire on Spirit Reflections. I'm Fred Gouveia, and today we're going to be talking about the Jews of Spiritism in Brazil, how the different cultures in Brazilian spirituality, Afro-Brazilian traditions, and European Brazilian traditions have mixed with the Jewish population of Brazil. This is a fascinating episode that I've had a chance to explore here on the channel with other guests that are like Andrea Kogan and other scholars. And those links of those episodes are also here in the description below, so you can explore further. But today we're going to be bringing here around the fire Alex Minkin, who's a visual anthropologist, a cultural activist, and the director of Tikkun Brazil. And since 2012, he has been focusing his research on the intersections between Jewish and Brazilian spiritualities. He's lectured at Columbia University, NYU, Hebrew University, conferences and cultural centers in Brazil, US, and Israel. And his first documentary, Urban Orishas, in 2022 about the Brazilian art and religion in New York, was an official selection of the Heritals, I hope I pronounced that right, and the Rendezvous Film Festival. So without further ado, before we get into this conversation, let's meet Alex. Alex, welcome around the fire here on Spirit Reflections. Good to have you.
Great to be in your program, Fred. I'm a big fan for quite a long time. Thanks for having this unique way to learn about spiritualities of the world with focus on Brazil.
Honored to hear you're a fan. Glad to hear. So, Alex, before we jump into the topic, we always like to get to know our guests first. So, why don't you share a little bit about your trajectory in your childhood and what led you eventually to become interested in the work that you do today?
Thank you. So, in Slovakia, they say the more languages you know, the more lives you have. And sometimes I feel I have many lives, as I know quite a few languages. I grew up in Moscow, Russia. I am Jewish ethnically, and unfortunately not culturally as it started, because Jewish culture and religion was forbidden mostly in the former Soviet Union, where I grew up in the 70s and 80s. And forbidden fruit is sweet, so I always was looking for ways to get the taste of it. And some Jewish culture was available through official Soviet channels, but it was rather superficial and more of a communist in content and sometimes Yiddish in form. But you had to dig deeper and listen to foreign radio stations that were jammed. And I'm not talking about the sweet guava jam here, noise on the frequencies of radios. But I was getting some information from BBC, from Voice of America, that is now being closed by the current American government. What a twist. It took more than KGB, but Trump to finish the job. Anyway, back then it was all those foreign radio stations and forbidden books that I was reading with gloves, not to leave fingerprints. That was the environment.
So how is it like, I'm curious, growing up in a culture, in an environment where the subject of religiosity itself was forbidden? How was that explained to you by your parents, for example?
I grew up in a very secular family with 2 generations away from active religious experience. My grandfather grew up in a family of rabbis and cantors in Shtetl, in a small village in Ukraine, where religion was part of the daily life of every Jew. But then Bolshevik Revolution, Communist Revolution happened, and it was a choice of most of the Jews to explore non-religious lifestyle and distance themselves from religion. But then it was no longer a choice. It was a government policy to forbid religions. And while all religions were forbidden, as George Orwell say in Animal Farm, everyone is equal, but some are more equal than others.
Right.
So Judaism was more equal, more forbidden than other religions.
Right.
And it was dangerous to enter synagogue. I remember when I was a child, my father was not allowed me to go to synagogue for practical reasons. It was dangerous for his job. He could be called to the special department, KGB department at his job, to talk about that because people were photographed entering synagogue. So religions were rather underground experience. People were doing that, but they were people defined not to live as part of the Soviet lifestyles. They were on the way out, or they were non-conformists who were working as janitors, and there were no way to have a career in Soviet Union and be a religious person, unless you are assigned by KGB to be a chief priest, which is another story.
Oh, wow. That's an interesting story. As like a kind of like a spy in that community to be assigned to chief priests.
Yes, you indeed. It was a spy and also a way of promoting values of Soviet Union in under the umbrella of the church. So dancing on the two weddings, as they say.
It makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, so then that's the environment you grew up in, and you're catching some radio signals from BBC, from Voice of America. That's shaping also your understanding of other parts of the world. At what point do you move to the West?
Yes, so I started Jewish education and a bit of a religious education at the end of my life in the Soviet Union, the early 90s, in the first official program of Jewish studies organized by Jewish Theological Seminary, so Jewish religious school of conservative Judaism, a more liberal form of Judaism. And then I moved to United States in 1992, 33 years ago, to study at Yeshiva University, which is a more religious school of modern Orthodox. That's the more liberal of the traditional Jewish religion. There are so many different types of Judaism in the world.
Right.
So I continued, and I learned much more about Judaism in New York while I studied for 4 years at Yeshiva University with rabbis and studying Talmud, which is the second layer of Judaism, Torah being the first one, explaining what Torah exactly means. And then there is a mystical layer, a third layer, which is Kabbalah, which traditional Jews only allowed to study after they finish with first two layers, which takes 40 years approximately of dedicated Jew, non-distracted by social media, to study. And then you're allowed to study Kabbalah.
And on which layer does the Zohar fit in this process, if at all?
Sure. Zohar is a part of Kabbalah. It's a mystical layer of Judaism. So it's a really mystical interpretation of Torah and Talmud.
I see. Gotcha. I'm curious, before you continue on the timeline of your life, how was it like to have the experience of living in Moscow during the late 80s, early 90s, when your entire worldview was sort of flipped upside down, as it were?
Mine was not. My worldview was very much expecting this to happen. I never believed in official Soviet theology, if you will. So it was really a quasi-religion of communism, where different saints were put, different idols rather were put on altar of Marx, Lenin, Engels, etc. But so I was not really upset about what were happening. I was very happy that all of a sudden access to books that I was reading with gloves before is given free access. Books that were read over BBC and jammed now were available in print in Soviet media. It was very exciting time actually to live in the late 80s in Moscow.
So I guess was the writing on the wall amongst the people that you hung out with for those a few years prior to it, it was sort of like we know this is bound to happen anytime now. Let's just wait and see when it happens.
It was mixed, really, because some people indeed believed in Soviet propaganda, and for them, it was a rather traumatic experience to see that the beliefs are not true. I had a professor of, or rather, a teacher of literature in my school who I believe committed suicide. That was the
Wow.
most extreme response because he indeed believed that Soviet culture was true and it was sacred to him, and he was extremely depressed learning that
Wow.
was not the case. But
Wow.
luckily, most of the people I was surrounded with were very cynical about official Soviet propaganda, and where the questions were how to respond, how to survive in a very difficult world of post-Soviet collapse, where
Right.
food was difficult to obtain.
Oh wow. And how much of that drove your decision to come to New York?
I was thinking of leaving Soviet Union since I was 7 because of
Wow.
a very severe anti-Semitism. So that was really a
Gotcha.
trauma that affected my upbringing and my responses to many things in the world, including Brazilian spirituality, which we get to.
Gotcha.
It's my personal trauma of anti-Semitism growing up in Soviet Russia. So I was on the way to out since early. Question is to which country, and I was considering Israel, and then opportunity to study in the United States came up, which was a great opportunity, and I took it, and I never regretted my choice.
Beautiful. And when you moved to New York to study at Yeshiva University, what were you studying specifically there?
Well, it was general studies in the United States. Unlike Soviet Russia and some other countries, you don't have to choose your major right
Right.
away. You have to choose on the third year of 4-year college. And I was enjoying for first 2 years learning things that I could never imagine, including Jewish history. Anthropology was one of my favorites, and it became subject of my my focus later on in life. But indeed, it was a little bit of everything, including Russian literature that I could not study freely in
Wow.
Moscow. So
That
I
never
studied.
thought of that. Exactly. You sort of go out on the outside looking in. You have a much broader view in that case than if you were inside, right? The Soviet channels, official.
But yeah, indeed. And then I had to focus, and anthropology became one of the focuses, and technology became another focus. My day job is working for Department of Education in New York, so and technology
Cool.
department.
And Alex, going back to those days when you were in yeshiva and having to choose on the third year what you were going to focus on, what drew you to anthropology?
Well, I think it's a combination of interest to spirituality and scientific mindset of a scholar that was forming at the time and that was brought up at that program that I mentioned in Moscow, JTS, was actually doing a combination of the two. I was trained as archivist in Moscow to study archives that were suddenly opened to Western scholars, and they needed specialists who knew Hebrew, Yiddish, and Jewish history knowledge and
Wow.
Jewish theology knowledge. So they were training us for all of that, and we were lucky to have teachers from Sorbonne, Oxford, Hebrew University, Brown University, top schools of the world, descending as part of Program Judaica. That's what it was called. The amazing program of Jewish learning of organized under auspices of Jewish Theological Seminary. So anthropology, to answer your question, was a natural choice for me where I could combine interest uh, to the folk religions and to different comparative religions. studies and making it in a systematic academic way.
Beautiful. So you were there at the doorsteps, welcoming the scholars of the world as these archives were being opened, and they were exploring, I guess, hundreds of years of history there that were previously unaccessible, right?
Indeed. Well, 70 years of Soviet Russia, to be
Right.
more.
Yeah, yeah. There you go. Yes, the communist years. And then
They
how
are
do you
closed
end up?
again.
Sorry.
They are closed again thanks to current government.
Oh Lord. Yeah. Unfortunately, we're
But there
regressing
was
in
there was a period.
we were regressing on currently in many parts of the world. Hopefully, we'll overcome this weird time we're living in. So, all right, you're in New York. You're delving into all of these different technology, anthropology, and how do you end up discovering the spiritual traditions of Brazil?
Well, I was called in Soviet Russia. I was called ruthless cosmopolitan. That's the code word for Jews in Soviet Russia. They are by
Oh,
definition traitors, people with no country, scapegoats. But we took this term with pleasure. It's a great to be a ruthless cosmopolitan. It's great to belong to the earth with all
right,
this variety of cultures. And once I had a chance to travel, I started to explore different countries. I traveled to Thailand, to Europe, and each every place had its own treasures to be explored. But somehow, only in Brazil, it clicked to me that I need to connect to local culture. I fell in love with the Portuguese language, to Brazilian people. I became friends with so many people. I think I have more friends in Brazil than anywhere in the world.
nice,
And later on, I realized that maybe one of the reasons is I have this Jewish connection. I'm looking for Jewish connections, and Brazil has so many descendants of crypto Jews, of Jews who discovered Brazil under Portuguese. One third of Portuguese people who went colonizing Brazil were actually Jews who were forcefully converted to Christianity by Inquisition of Portugal. So it ended up mixing with local population and ended up with millions of people in Brazil who are now descendants of Jews. So maybe
right.
started connecting with Brazil because of such a underground, such a background, and this secret feeling of Jewishness that
For
was
sure.
present in
Uh,
Brazil
the
everywhere.
the little that I dug in my own history, the last name Gouveia from Madeira Island in Portugal is 99% Jewish. The probability of my ancestors on my father's side being Jewish converted to Christianity is very high. So, okay, so then we're gonna. I think what we could do is for those that are watching on YouTube, I'm gonna show the clip of your most recent documentary called Saravá Shalom. Uh, is just a 2-minute trailer. There are subtitles in the screen that you're going to see here, and I'm going to leave the link in the description. And then we can talk a little bit about that. I'm jumping ahead, but we could maybe go back and weave how you got to Saravá Shalom after we see the trailer. How does that sound?
Sounds great. Let's do it.
Okay, beautiful. So let me share the screen here.
Nobody has ever studied about it. So there are no scholars and serious works about it. The connection of Judaism, the connection of Jews with other religions here in Brazil. Everything is so stereotyped or sometimes so stigmatized and so closed that nobody knows about it. or if they hear about it, they are not comfortable talking about it because it's such a taboo.
A primeira estrela do céu tem 6 pontas. A primeira estrela do céu tem 6 pontas. E quem adentra esse terreiro são os filhos de Israel. Na sexta-feira acendem vela para os anjos lá do céu.
Então, o Brasil, na verdade, é uma espécie de grande laboratório, né, onde crenças praticamente incompatíveis se encontraram, se juntaram, se fundiram e se reproduziram com outras formas.
E eu dou graças a Deus que eu sou judia espírita, porque eu acho que se eu não tivesse na doutrina, eu não ia aguentar a partida do meu filho. Que foi uma coisa assim. Mas a doutrina me ajudou e me ajuda muito. Muito, 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 muito.
Eu tinha que ritualizar isso. E não me parecia suficiente acender uma vela só aqui em cima. Me parecia muito pouco. Botar um copo de água para quem foi queimado, acender vela e pedir paz. De certa maneira, me parecia até cínico, de tão pouco.
Eu tive contato com um espírito que era um rabino, e ele me falou sobre a manifestação da água. Falou que em todos os lugares, as pessoas, em todas as religiões, as pessoas bebem água em diferentes copos e recipientes, mas que no final é a mesma água que elas estão bebendo. No caminho do terreiro eu encontrei uma mulher, vinha linda e perfumada, eu quis saber quem ela é. Pomba gira judia, judia ela vem caminhando, ela chega girando na ponta do pé. Pomba gira judia, judia ela vem caminhando, ela chega girando na ponta do pé.
What a beautiful voice she has, huh?
Indeed, all the automatic translations, subtitles are terrible.
They are, yes.
How it was
Technology.
translated.
As a technologist aficionado yourself, I'm sure it's definitely not there yet. Maybe it'll take a few years for YouTube to figure it out. But yeah. Okay, but we skipped way ahead. I'd like to go back a little bit in time. You were traveling the world, you've discovered the people, you discovered the traditions, and this huge migration of Jews through Portugal and other parts of Europe that sort of mixed into Brazil. And so sort of take us from there, Alex, if you will, until we get to the documentary that we just saw.
Well, I came a bit to Brazil a bit later than New Christians did. It was a next level of next wave of immigration, or rather tourism. So I came to Brazil for the first time in '96, and I've been coming since then. But at first it was a tourist trip, and I was just fascinated with what I've seen. The first time visiting favela, becoming friends with local Jewish activists. And later on, I realized that I want to give back to the country, and I wanted to create my own volunteering project, volunteering organization, NGO, ONGO in Portuguese, that would help connect volunteers from all over the world with the local volunteering opportunities. And I wanted to have focus and do something that other organizations don't do. It would be a Jewish volunteering organization. So at that point, I already had a lot of friends and contacts in Brazilian Jewish world. So I created Tikkun Brazil, and the name Tikkun stands for improvement the world. It's a mystical concept in Judaism. It's called Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, literally. The idea is that when the world was created, the vessels fell down and shattered, and there are small pieces shattered all around the world. And in order to repair the world, to put this together, to fix all the problems, the wars, the misery, one needs to put those small pieces together and put the divine vessels together. It's a beautiful mystical concept, but it's also used for practical symbolism of practical actions, small but significant actions of small pieces that we take and put together. So, for example, going to favelas and to comunidades, to communities, poor communities in Brazil, and teach kids how to use a toothbrush, because this specific action was requested by some local activists. So the idea was to match the skills of visiting tourists, Jewish descent primarily. That was my focus, from Israel, Canada, United States, Europe, and match their skills with local needs. So if there is a need to teach dance, ballet maybe, and we have someone from ballet school in Belgium willing to spend few weeks or few months ideally. There are young people who are out there for a few months traveling, and they want to do something meaningful. So
they connects Jewish volunteers from all over the world to act as volunteers in Brazil. Very nice.
And it was not just experiences, as far as Brazilian experience concerned. So we take Jews from other countries and provide local experience, going to these poor communities, teach photography, for example. We had this program called Photos for Favelas, where photographers from the north, from United States, would teach people in Rocinha, in the largest community favela in the world, I think, in Rio de Janeiro, how to make professional photos. So they spent a few months there, those photographers from United States, and then the resulting photos made by kids in Rocinha, in this favela, were exhibited all around the world, and some of the photos were sold, and all the money went to kindergarten in this community, and most importantly, the kids were trained to be professional photographers, and that helped them. This is the learning how to fish that helped them to.
Yes, exactly.
Professionals join the work.
Amazing. So at what point during your travels do you start getting connected to these Afro-Brazilian spiritualities like Candomblé, Umbanda, etc.?
So I'm always interested in, I was always interested in the spiritualities and manifestation of spiritualities. I'm also interested in theater and music, avant-garde theater and avant-garde music specifically. So when a friend of mine took me to a small Afro-Brazilian temple, Terreiro, in the northern zone of Rio de Janeiro, in Estácio, to be specific, if you know geography of Rio de Janeiro. So there's a very small and powerful temple that I entered. And at first I thought I'm entering avant-garde theater in downtown New York, because it felt like that. People dressed up and they're doing something mysterious. And it reminded me of Richard Foreman, my favorite avant-garde director in New York. But then I also felt this energy, this mystery in the air when people were hugging each other, and I felt the energy of like electricity were passing through the air in this small place, and I didn't understand much, but I felt the mystery, I felt this energy, and I wanted to come back. I wanted to learn more about it, and I also, through this connection of Tikkun Brazil, connection to local Jewish organization, I saw that all, if not majority, if not all, of my friends of Jewish descent and non-Jews, most of Brazilians attend spiritual ceremonies in Umbanda, Candomblé, Kardecism. They don't talk about it for some reason. I didn't know why. Andrea Cogan explained later. It's a taboo, as you saw in this video. And yet it was an important presence in everyone's life. So I wanted to learn more why Jews go there, why Brazilians go there, what do they find, and is there a Jewish element in those ceremonies? That became my question. So why people go? And again, I want to have a focus, just like with Tikkun Brazil. I couldn't do everything.
Right.
I wanted to focus on specific thing, and I realized that Jewish presence in Afro-Brazilian, in spiritualism, in Afro-Brazilian religion and Kardecism is not explored at all. So
Right.
there was not a book of Andrea Kogan yet. There were only one paragraph in Diana Brown, American scholar from Columbia University. She wrote one paragraph in her field studies in 1970s that while doing extensive studies of Umbanda in Brazil, she's the leading scholar on the subject outside of Brazil, she came across a small congregation of Jewish Umbandists, consisted entirely of Jews, and they used the techniques of Umbanda, techniques of spirit possession to explore Judaism. So they would they would summon prophets of Old Testaments. So Jews normally study Torah by reading, not by calling the spirits. But these guys were actually, if they had any questions, they were just summoning this prophet and asking questions. So they were doing very Brazilian thing in the form, but very Jewish in the content. They were doing Jewish Umbanda. So unfortunately, Diana Brown only wrote one paragraph, but it blew my mind away, and I wanted to study that, and I did.
So it is mind-blowing, because the little that I know about Judaism, you shouldn't be communing with the dead. You should not be evoking the dead, right?
Well, yes and no. There is no pope in Judaism. There is no single authority who tells you what to do and what not to do. The reality on the ground is very different from what you said. On the ground, we have people in Jewish community, very respected people, including rabbis and definitely spiritual healers who would explore communication with the dead. So from Prophet Samuel in Bible, in Jewish Bible, to various cases of there's this book maybe. Well, I don't know if we have. You can read it.
Spirit possession in Judaism.
Indeed.
Fantastic.
Can you see it the right way, or is it turned because I see it reflected the other, like mirror.
I can see pretty well.
Okay.
Oops.
No, okay.
Wrong.
To me, it shows mirror reflection somehow. I don't know why.
Here we go. Yeah.
Anyway, so this is the serious anthropological study of the subject, and that talks about spirit possession practices in Judaism. And it's mostly about exorcism of bad spirits.
Right. That's what I thought. By judging the book by its cover, that's what I figured. It wasn't an intentional, purpose-driven seance, but more like, okay, this person is having an episode. Let's find a way to release her or him from the spirit, kind of thing, right?
Yes and no.
Okay, great.
There are spirits to be thrown away, to have exorcism with, but also you would connect to your ancestors. You would connect to good spirits in the Jewish tradition. Now there is a professor, Annie Cohen, in London, who I'll share the link to her studies, but she studies the folk Judaism practices of connecting to the dead. It was very common in the shtetls, in Jewish villages in Eastern Europe, to have folk healers who would connect in various ways to the dead. For example, they would create soul candles measuring the graves of the deceased people, and then with the wick that you measure the grave, you create the soul candle to connect to the soul of the deceased. And there were various ways to invoke the dead ancestors. Yet, indeed, it's not something that you would find in mainstream Judaism, but it's increasingly welcomed in more liberal strains of Judaism or Jewish culture, if you will, outside of the synagogues.
Yeah, because mediumship is present in every tradition, culture, and period of history. And it's great that you brought this book cover to show that it's always been there, but perhaps the mainstream Jewish culture or identity doesn't really like to talk about it as much, and perhaps might be the reason why Andrea was telling you about the fact that so many Jews in Brazil also go to these spiritualist temples and go to synagogue, but most of them keep it under wraps, perhaps, right?
Yes. So there are different reasons why it's been a taboo in Brazil. On one hand, it's looked down upon in Judaism. On the other hand, the religions that we're talking about are considered to be low-class religions. At least Afro-Brazilian religions are stigmatized and ostracized. They are not considered to be proper religions for middle upper class citizens to be engaged with. At least that was the case. And it still remained very controversial and not serious. And it takes gringos, takes foreigners to explain Brazilians that Afro-Brazilian religions are actually some of the most valuable part of Brazilian cultural experience.
Indeed. We had a Pai de Santo from Candomblé in the channel recently. He just gave a glimpse of the complex mythology of the different Orishas and the history. And it was fascinating just to get a glimpse of how rich and how ancient these myths are about, revolving around each Orisha. I just wanted to have him on the air for like many, many hours just to explore a little bit further. So do you think these attitudes are changing, Alex, about looking sort of frowning upon or looking down at these religions?
Well, it's changing back and forth, and it started. It's been very good for Kardecism because it's something that became gradually accepted in Brazilian society. It was not in the beginning. It was considered to be still something improper because of communication with the dead by Catholic Church. But this, I don't know if you can see it, this without mirror, but this is the book about the first and only Jewish Kardecist center that still exists in Maracanã in Rio de Janeiro, founded by the Jews. It's called the Center of the Jews. So the old lady that you've seen in the video that you showed is a member of the center. So Kardecism is something that's been very well accepted by Brazilian society, I believe, because it's considered to be very, well, I should call it its name. It's white. It's
right. Yes.
as something that is appropriate for middle and upper class to be engaged with. With Candomblé and Umbanda, it's definitely became popular since counterculture of 60s and 70s in Brazil, when Brazilian cultural figures turned to local spiritual practices of Umbanda. And then to Candomblé, when Umbanda was considered to be too white and too mainstream and too Catholic, too Christian, and taking away the original African ingredients. Although it's very complicated, I don't agree with this simplistic view of Umbanda.
Yeah, it is They're very simplistic indeed, because there's so many different strains and ramifications within Candomblé, within Umbanda, just like within Judaism. And what did you begin to notice, Alex, in the beginning of your research, that you mentioned you found some Jewish elements in Candomblé practices, for example?
Well, Candomblé is actually rather advanced and difficult to find Jewish elements of. I started this conversation, or I mentioned maybe that I attended Candomblé ritual. It was before we started taping, so I have to tell you again. What's on the surface are Jewish symbols, 6-point star, sometimes menorah. The origins of it is rather unclear, and people who are practicing Umbanda not always tell you the reasons they bring these symbols in. So I was observing those Jewish symbols that are on the surface in the beginning. I started my anthropological studies with people of the East, which is the one of the sides, one of the directions that Umbanda is taking. So Umbanda worships or calls various spirits. It's really a Brazilian stage, as Reginaldo Prandi, the biggest scholar of our Brazilian religions, once called Umbanda. It's the theater of Brazil. So in this theater, on this stage, you have a room for all Brazilian characters. Primarily, you would find spirits of enslaved Africans and indigenous people in Umbanda. But there is also room for Romani people, for Ciganos, for example, and they are part of Eastern line of Umbanda. So in this Eastern line of Umbanda, first I researched in my anthropological studies, I researched Romani people. I wrote research about that. I can share a link in that on that research. Then I started to see more manifestations, more occurrences of Jewish spirits. So who are the Jewish spirits? I would say there are several categories. There are mystical messengers that come as rabbis, and they teach mysticism of Kabbalah, Zohar, as you mentioned, or Kabbalah in general, without giving much details. It comes from esoteric Kabbalah. Kabbalah has various levels, regionally Jewish Kabbalah, then interpretation of Kabbalah by Christians, and then esoteric Kabbalah, which is the third level. So in Brazil, it comes, Kabbalah came through various channels, including Jews, possibly secret Jews that practice Judaism had some elements of Kabbalah in their practices, and maybe they taught to the slaves at that time. And that's how it entered Afro-Brazilian religions. It also entered Afro-Brazilian religions, according to the stories that passed in temples, through the Jews, the secret Jews who escaped to Quilombos. So Quilombos were the villages of persecuted Africans, enslaved Africans who escaped, and they found those free zones, free villages that were accepted. Everyone who was rejected by Brazilian Portuguese government at the time, including some of the secret Jews, the Jews who wanted to practice Judaism, and they could only practice them in the places like backlands of Brazil, Sertão of Brazil, but also in Quilombos. And in Quilombos, they met Afro-Brazilians who incorporated some of the Kabbalah in the early religion of Cachimbo, of Jurema, where you find some references to King Solomon, Hey Solomon. So the earliest references that I found, I digged deeper, and it took years in my research, attending so many temples, speaking to so many mediums. So the stories that passed in the temples of Jurema, of Cachimbo, of Umbanda are of those Kabbalists, early Kabbalists, who hundreds of years ago encountered Pretos Velius, the enslaved Africans, and taught them Kabbalah and brought some of the Jewish symbols that now can be found in 6-point stars and etc. And King Solomon.
Alex, when you say they could practice their religion like openly, the Jews, so we're going back to the Inquisition era. Like, are we talking about 17th century Brazil here, 1600s?
Well, if we want to start from the beginning, the first wave of Jews came with the Brazilian explorers, with the Portuguese colonizers, and 1/3 of them were Jews converted to Christianity by Inquisition. So those Jews, when they reached Brazil, some of them practiced Judaism secretly. Some of them, when had a chance to practice more freely, they used this chance, and quilombos, according to the stories passed in the temples, were places where those Jews encountered Afro-Brazilians, which resulted in early influences on Afro-Brazilian religions from the Jewish side.
That's really fascinating. I never thought of this. A quilombo being a place that welcomes the excluded from society, and in those quilombos, the enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples of Brazil having a chance to meet the Jews that are able to practice their religion more freely there. It's such a great cultural mix and exchange that's taking place there. I had never thought about that element. That's fascinating. So you through your studies, you realize that some of those elements from Jewish tradition were passed down in those environments, in those times.
Indeed. Attending ceremonies on the north of Brazil, where some of the old mediums keep traditions and songs and words and rituals that passed along generations, made me aware of these practices. In the 80s, Professor Sid Greenfield from University of Milwaukee wrote about this encounter when he entered the main Umbanda temple in Fortaleza, and he was greeted as a descendant of King Solomon because he looked just like King Solomon on the wall. King Solomon is the patron saint of Umbanda in Ceará.
Really?
And when he was asked his nationality, his ethnicity, he didn't want to say it first because he thought that Jews would be blamed for killing of Christ, and it's not a good thing to say. But when he said that he was Jewish, after insistence of the Pai de Santo, of the priest, he said he's Jewish, and then he was greeted very warmly because Jews are very crucial for Umbanda, he was told. Jews brought Kabbalah to Umbanda, and we respect that, and we have King Solomon as our saint patron, beautiful. And it's the main saint in Umbanda of Ceará. You see his portraits everywhere. So I started recording that. Unfortunately, Professor C. Greenfield, just like Diana Brown, they worked together. They didn't follow up on that research on the Jewish elements on Umbanda. They only wrote in passing about this phenomenon that they encountered. But I had a chance to really to make this focus of my studies for a number of years.
Fantastic. I'm curious, Alex, if you'd be able to explain this, because I've always thought of it and I never really understood. I've heard some plausible ideas about it, but I'm curious to hear your take on it. How come the enslaved Africans that were taken to Brazil developed these Afro-Brazilian spiritual traditions that are so unique and different, whereas the enslaved Africans that were taken here to North America seem to have not brought as much of these traditions with them, and it seems like instead they embraced Protestant Christianity?
Both waves of enslaved people brought this tradition with them. It's just that what happened next is different. In the United States, there were less enslaved people, first of all, and they were persecuted much more than in Brazil. So it was ruthlessly eradicated in the States. And also, the last slaves were brought to the United States a longer time ago than in Brazil. In Brazil, the last slave ships were still coming in the middle of 19th century. And with them, they were bringing fresh infusion of African religions with them. So combination of much more people, much more recent waves of Africans coming to Brazil, and much less enforcement of persecution in Brazil. Together, that resulted in African religion preserved much better in Brazil. And we have yet another book I want to show you, Mythology of Orishas and Saravá, who is quoted in the video that you showed. He is the most important scholar of Brazilian religion in Brazil. So he put together this book of Orishas stories for the first time. It's an oral tradition, but he put it together in Brazil, because in Brazil it was preserved much better than other places. Now this book is taught in Africa, where these traditions are unfortunately in much worse shape than in Brazil, not to mention in the United States, they're they're coming from Brazil, perhaps, in translation.
I see. So not only the time of their arrival in the U.S. was much earlier, less of them, but also the enforcement of ruthlessly sort of condemning their practices and wanting to enforce Christianity or impose Christianity on them in the U.S. was much more severe than the way the Portuguese Catholics did in Brazil. Is that?
That is correct. In Brazil, it preserved much better. There is a Brazilian film, Pagador de Promessas, Keeper of the Promises, from 1962, the most successful Brazilian entry in Cannes. This year, Brazil did very well with the Best Director, Best Actor, but there was a Best Film that Brazil got in Cannes in 1962, the only time, I believe. And that was the film about syncretism, religious syncretism, where Afro-Brazilian religion survived in Brazil, African religion survived in Brazil with the facade of Christianity. And that's what this film is about. It's fascinating, which not
gotta check it out.
Everyone knows Black Orpheus, perhaps a bit earlier. That's where Bossa Nova started. But there is a very similar film as far as Brazilian folklore. You hear a lot of music. It's beautifully made, and it was competed against Fellini and Antonioni that year, 1962. And it won. So I highly recommend check out Keeper of the Promises, 1962. It talks just about that phenomenon of preserving Afro-Brazilian religions, African religions in Brazil. The main character is making a sacrifice to African god of Yansá, and but he's doing it under the Santa Barbara surface, because each African Orisha is syncretized, is matched with a Christian saint, and that's what this film is about. And that's how one of the reasons it was able to survive. There was a brilliant invention. On the surface for missionaries, you could see a Christian temple. You see all these Christian saints, Santa Barbara, etc. But each saint had a key, had a secret layer of African Orisha. It was not about Santa Barbara at all.
Right. It's like almost that, like they're giving a wink. Look, I'll pretend to be Santa Barbara here so that you can survive. Wow. That's amazing. So in 2025, where is your work taking you as far as this subject matter goes? Jews in Brazil and spirituality in Brazil and those cross-cultural currents.
It's a very exciting year for my studies after years of presenting at various conferences, representing Brazil. Speaking of ruthless cosmopolitan, I've been representing Brazil in conference of Judaic Studies in Jerusalem, together with
Nice.
Michel German and Chris Vital, amazing scholars in Rio. We're in the same panel. I was the only non-Brazilian technically, but representing Brazil. So it was all about conferences, lectures in academia, and publishing articles, which is great, but it's reaching somewhat limited audience. So in 25, I'm trying something else. I'm releasing the film called Saravá Shalom. There is an English title, Synagogue of Ancestral Commitments. It's about paying respects to different ancestors, African, indigenous, and Jewish, and this mixture of synagogue and tahir and a temple. So this film, it's a long feature. Unlike the first film that you mentioned, it was only 10 minutes long. Now it's 1 hour and 40 minutes of poetic reflections, poetic essay on the subject of Jews in Umbanda, Kardecism, and Candomblé.
And how can people watch your Synagogue of Ancestral Commitments film?
It depends where you are. I just came back from the mini tour of pre-screening in Brazil. So if you were there, you could watch there. I'll be back to Brazil in October. And in the middle of next month, I'm going to Berlin by invitation of Potsdam University to present both in Potsdam and in Berlin in the Brazilian embassy, again, representing Brazil.
Cool. Nice.
So if you're in Berlin, you're lucky. But otherwise, it will be on the film festivals for a while.
Beautiful.
And then next year, I think it will be released on YouTube.
Nice. And how has the response been from these screenings, both from the Jewish community that attended and the non-Jewish community? I guess the people that were not Jews, not Jewish. How was that like?
It's very diverse. Most people either hate it or love it, which is great. No one is indifferent. So, and we have very different people in the audience and very different places where it was shown. The premiere of pre-screening was in Recife in Fundação Joaquim Nabuco, which is an art house cinema, which normally shows Bergman, Lynch, and it doesn't show ethnographic anthropological film, which was
right.
Great for me because I'm a fan of all those art house directors. So the public, the audience was people who are used to watch art films, and they were judging the film by the beauty of the images, by the mystery, without knowing the anthropological, the Umbanda or Jewish side that much. And it passed the test for many of them. They said it's a beautiful film, which is great to hear. And then Ronaldo Brito was one of the discussants of the film afterwards. So after each screening in Brazil, there were hours of discussions longer than the film itself.
Nice.
Ronaldo Brito is amazing, a Brazilian writer who was translated to many languages, Hebrew, French, etc. Not English yet. I think his book is coming in English translation later this year, called Galilea. It's about Brazilians in the backlands of Brazil discovering the ancestors and the connection to the past and present. It's a beautifully written book, and he wrote more than 20 books. Galilea is probably the most famous one. His new book is called Rio Negro. So he was one of the people discussing it, and he said that it's beautiful as an art film, but also as a mysterious film about Brazilian religion and interactions of different diasporas. So later was shown in universities and Jewish centers, and each time there were different responses. For example, Michel German, who is the Brazilian scholar, probably the most famous Brazilian Jewish scholar at the moment, he said it's one of the most beautiful films that he's seen in years, but he's still puzzled about the anthropological side of it, because it's unlike anything he's seen. It's not discussed in academia yet. They are talking about imaginary Jews in Christianity, in Pentecostal movement. In São Paulo, there's this big Solomon temple in the middle of São Paulo, a replica of of Jerusalem temple. So there's a lot of talk in academia about Jewish symbols in Christianity, but way before Christianity in Brazil, before the imaginary Jews in Christianity, Umbanda and other native Brazilian religions already had Jewish themes. And that's what my studies are about, but it's a first study, if you're not counting
Right.
Kogan, and that's about Kardecism.
Exactly. Do you find this phenomenon of syncretism between Jewish culture and local culture in other parts of the world, like in Brazil?
Yes, definitely. There's definitely a connection of Judaism and Buddhism. There's a very influential book, which I'm sure Andrea Kogan told you about, Jew in the Lotus, that came out in the early 90s, that influenced all of us. Many people. It's about encounter of Dalai Lama with rabbis. Dalai Lama needed advice how to survive in exile, because Buddhists were just exiled from China, and instead they needed advice from Jews who had 2,000 years worth of experience in exile. So Jewish-Buddhist connections are very strong in the United States. There is a definitely unproportional number of Jews in American Buddhism. Among the leaders of Buddhism, there is a Jewish Buddhists. So there's very strong interaction. In Europe, there are spiritual seekers, soul seekers of Jewish descent in various religions as well. In Israel, there's very strong movement of channeling, which is a light form of possession, which is kind of a modern way of, a more contemporary way of Spiritism. So Israeli Jews exploring techniques of channeling, sometimes in Jewish way, sometimes in an international way.
Very nice. Well, your work is fascinating, and I really hope that the people on the channel can discover it. And I'll leave all of the links in the description of the video, also for those that are watching that want to have volunteer opportunities in Brazil, and you would like to share some talent of yours. Contact Tikkun Brazil and Alex. I'll leave all of the information here. Any final words you'd like to share, or any final announcements you'd like us to have here before we end this conversation?
Well, thank you for having me here. There are many topics that we can continue talking about. Message to people in Brazil, hopefully, and to scholars is please study native Brazilian religions. There is so much to learn about. There is so much undocumented still that remains to be documented. My next project is about songs of King Solomon in Jurema, in the local Brazilian religion. It's undocumented still. It's beautiful, and there are mediums who are getting old who remember those traditions. So if you are a scholar, please spend more time and take Afro-Brazilian and native Brazilian religions more serious, and study lesser known topics outside of mainstream, such as Jewish themes, maybe in Umbanda and other native Brazilian religions. And please check out Saravá Shalom wherever you are, or Synagogue of Ancestral Commitments. It will be in Berlin, June 16th and 19th, and different festivals around the world later, and in Brazil in October.
Alex, much luck and success in your work and your travels. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your light, and all of these beautiful syncretic cross currents that you discovered in Brazil. I'm very happy that you're here. Everybody, look at the links in the description of this video to follow Alex and his work, and also like, follow, subscribe to Spirit Reflections so you can be on top of all of our future episodes around the fire. Thank you again.
Thank you, Fred.
Take care.
Bye-bye.